Oh, Lego. Okay. All right. So tonight's debate is: does the meaning of life have meaning? Our prompt is going to be: what does the meaning of life signify? Is it a coherent idea at all? And even if it's not coherent or signifies nothing, is it a useful or pragmatic concept for our everyday lives? So in our first debater is going to be Varsity Bookworm. He's going to be taking the position that the meaning of life is not a coherent phrase. And our second debater will be Koco-Guru of Consumerism, and he's going to be defending the meaning of life as having something significant or some kind of substance to the term that we can look towards for our lives. All right, so I'm going to give you each just a minute to go over your brief synopsis, then we'll get into the debate itself. So Varsity, you begin.
Okay. I would say that this is something I've been thinking about for a few years, largely because of some of the discourse that I see in popular philosophically oriented media. If you want to use that phrase, I would just call it pop philosophy around this idea of the meaning of life. I think there's some good evidence that's been put forward by Leitch and Tartaglia that this concept actually is relatively ancient, like is only a couple of hundred years, which is interesting because I think there's this tendency to assume that this is a concept that people have always been thinking about, and that tends to lend itself to ahistoricism in the way we read contemporary ideas into the past. So then we have things like, oh, Socrates was actually searching for the meaning of life, and so on. Which, if there's an argument to be had for that, it would have to be: is there something analogous to the search for wisdom that Socrates was actually engaged in, and this search for meaning would be the first issue. The second issue being, I'm not convinced that this phrase is coherent. I guess we can stick with that. In simplest terms, I think that life is not something which can have or can lack meaning. I think it's kind of a categorical error that we're making. So that would be kind of the brief synopsis I would give.
All right, let's move on to Coco. So go ahead and give us your brief synopsis of your position.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when Varsity brought this up to me, I thought it was a really intriguing prompt. And to me, part of the reason that I felt I might have a case to make against what it is that he believes in this particular instance is because I believe that I don't think that life is like a meaning. I don't know the right, like, absent of or agnostic to having meaning. I do think that there is a bit of like a false dichotomy that arises from the Cartesian mind-body problem that kind of gets exacerbated by the idea of there being like a meaning of life, as if there's some sort of like mystical, esoteric thing out there that you could like do or not do that would make your life purposeful or not purposeful. But I think to eliminate the phrase completely from the lexicon, or to say that it doesn't have any place or coherence in our discussions about the way that we do life, I don't think that that's going to actually move us towards the goal of, I don't know, living a better life or enjoying life more, or even trying to understand the people around us more. And I do think that like the historicity of things is constantly in conflict with the way that we refer to things linguistically now. So I do think that we often take the lens of modernity back in time with us when we're looking at literature or art or anything, philosophy, as Varsity mentioned. But I don't think that that in itself is a substantial enough problem to justify us saying like this phrase that we use, even if it is kind of like a pop culture thing, is completely useless.
All right, thank you. All right, so let's move on to the debate portion. So I would say the most useful way to begin is Varsity, you give us your argument basically for why you do not think the phrase, the meaning of life, signifies anything, and what is the corollary to that? Like what comes from that, and what does that mean for people who are searching for that meaning? Go ahead.
We could do it that way. I was also thinking if me and Coco want to hash out what we mean by meaning, just what we mean by that word, that might save us a lot of time because I could present my arguments and he could come back and say, well, I don't agree with that because of the word meaning. So we could.
I'm absolutely down to start with definitions.
Right.
That's the best kind of debate, in my opinion.
So let's go ahead and let's clarify what we mean by meaning so that we can get that out of the way. Go ahead.
Do you want to go first, Coco, or do you want me to go first?
Yes. No, I can go first. So when I say that life has meaning, what I think is that, like, because you know how in English classes, they always try to tell you that literature is supposed to be reflective of the human experience, as if there's like some sort of universal thing that everybody goes through. I do think that there is actually a universal thing, whether it's like analogous and it doesn't actually exist as far as like everybody experiences this, or if it is something that does exist, which personally I kind of think it does. It feels a little bit trying to like cult leadery for me to say this the way that I want to say it, right? Because it feels like an observation that's just like so basic and benign that it actually doesn't have any meaning to it. But I feel like there's, and when I say meaning, I mean it doesn't have any like insight to it, right? But I think that like the meaning of life is pursuit in some capacity. Like everybody has a motivation to do something. I don't think there's anybody that's just like been born and laid there and died, right? Like, and if they did, it was because there was some sort of like biological malfunction that it, like inhibited the ability for them to pursue sustenance. And anyone who has like coherence or consciousness, most like in most cases, right? Obviously, there are going to be outliers, and there are like, what if this person existed, right? That's fine. I'm talking about like what is experienced by the observable majority is that we do pursue things at all times. So when I say meaning, what I'm getting at is that like there is some sort of meta human experience that is truly ubiquitous in the process of life and death that human beings experience.
Okay. So I guess when I asked what you mean by meaning, I guess I was kind of asking just what you mean by that word, like isolated from the phrase meaning of life. But I
isolated from the word. Yeah.
Yeah, like, and I guess the reason I'm asking that is I want to know if there's something else that this word is doing exclusively when it's plopped into this particular phrase that it isn't doing in any other context. That's what I'm kind of curious.
Yeah,
do you understand what I mean?
Does the syntax of the sentence change the meaning of the words within it? Does it give it a weightedness?
Exactly.
Yeah, I would think, like, if you're just going to ask me to define the word meaning, like, if someone, like, I can't Google it, right? Someone says, tell me what meaning means without Googling it. I would say the ability to be relatively defined, or relatively discovered.
Okay. So I guess let me give my definition of meaning. And then I would ask if there's something you feel is wrong with it, or if you feel like that doesn't capture enough for us to move forward with this word, or it captures too much. In either case, if it doesn't mean anything, it means nothing. If it means everything, it means nothing. You can tell me if there's something that you think is off with it.
Yeah.
Basically, the way that I would define meaning is that meaning refers to a relationship between two things, specifically a relationship in which one thing refers to something else. so that when we say the meaning of a given word, we have in mind whatever it is that word refers to.
Mm-hmm.
How
So
does
it's not
that
quite
sound?
like the Hegelian negation, but it's along the same lines.
You could tell me that Hegel has the exact same definition, and I wouldn't know whether you're telling the truth or not because I haven't read nearly any of Hegel, so I have no
No,
idea.
that's okay. Hegel and Sartre also have this, or has a similar concept where it's basically like when you're talking about a thing, you define the thing by what it is not by what it is. So we're just constantly speaking about things that don't like exist because it's the language is itself conceptual. The thing in itself like does exist, but we're not actually referring to it. Linguistically, we're using a symbolic representation of it in order to think about it. So like if I say it's dark, it's only dark because there is no light.
Mm-hmm.
And so
You're
like what
talking
I'm
about
hearing you say, go ahead.
differential definitions.
Something like that. Yeah. And when I hear you kind of define yours, it's like it's in relationship to another thing. I think that that's kind of like the meta linguistic way of describing meaning, right? It has a relationship with something else in a substantial enough way for us to be able to like talk about it or think about it or grab it, taste it, whatever. I could list off a bunch of verbs if I wanted to, but I think you get the drift.
Okay. And I want to be as transparent as possible because I think if we're okay with that sketch of what meaning means, there is something that I think we lose, and whether or not that is a big nightmare, you can let me know. But I think that if we accept that sketch of meaning, what we lose is any notion of meaning as being a property of a thing. So, like when we talk about the meaning of a word, it weirdly enough, paradoxically enough, that is not referring to something contained within that word, but rather within a relationship between that word and what it signifies, what it refers to. Are you
Right.
okay with that,
Yeah.
or is that going to rock the boat too much?
I think that I am okay with it, at least to move forward within the discussion. I reserve the right to change my mind if a point comes up that I think I would say, like, well, maybe we need to go back and take a step back and assess this again. But as of right now, I think that I don't have a problem with there not being a meaning in like the word itself, but there being a meaning or there being a purpose in the relationship of that word to other things.
Okay, yeah, no, that's fine.
If I'm understanding what you're saying, yeah.
Well, to bring it into...
Sorry,
go ahead.
I was gonna say I think now would be a good point then, since we kind of agree on that, to see what are the consequences of accepting such a definition.
Right, that's what I was going to get to. So to bring it into the context of the meaning of life business, if meaning describes a relationship between a thing and what it refers to, or what it signifies, or there's lots of other terms we can use to swap in there. If there is a meaning of life, and we're agreeing that this means that meaning is not a property of a thing, so there is no property of life such that that property is meaning, like there's something contained within this thing called life that we call meaning, but rather there is life and then there is something else, whatever it is, we don't know. There's life and something else, and these two things are somehow related to one another such that life is referring to this thing, signifying this thing, or what have you. My question would then be, what is that other thing?
Non-life. I think it'd be the opposite of life. In this case, that'd be death. That'd be like our experience of non-life is death in some capacity. And if I were using my like my cult guy hat, I'd be like the meaning of life is the pursuit, right? And at the end of life, the pursuit ends. So the thing that I'm saying constitutes or gives purpose to life, like it ceases to exist when life no longer. So they're intrinsically tied together.
So I hear you interchanging the word purpose with the word meaning. I mean, is that essentially what you mean by the meaning of life? You mean the purpose of life?
That's what, like, when like we were talking about the syntax of a sentence, right, and how it could change the meaning or change the implication. I don't think when people are saying like what's the meaning of life that they're looking for some sort of like empirically measurable thing that that they can like write down at the end and say that like that's great. I mean, maybe if you're like a particular kind of religion, you might believe that, but I believe that in this particular instance, purpose and meaning could be interchangeable in this phrase.
Okay, so that brings me back to the question that really kicked all this off, which is why do we have this extra superfluous phrase, meaning, if we already have a word that kind of already does what we want it to do and does it and seems to do it pretty well?
Well, you shared an article with me, that the one that kind of spawned this whole train of thought for you, and it made reference specifically to the idea that it's so funny. There's another guy in the server, Tower, would probably really love what this article had to say, because they were saying that like only artists can interpret the meaning of life. It kind of is like a hierarchical gatekeeping function to, I don't know, allow people to, I don't want to say be indoctrinated necessarily. I don't want to assume it's malicious, but like basically like shutting certain individuals out by saying like, well, you're not an artist, you're not of this elevated intellect or understanding of the world around us, so you can't like hypothesize like why you're here. You just kind of have to like take whatever it is that somebody hands to you. So like I will agree with you there that like if we go back to the origination of the phrase, that the context there doesn't look that great for like us. But I think that language evolves, and as that becomes part of like the pop lexicon of what the people refer to, and we change our viewpoints on the way that people can like postulate in their own individual lives about the things that are going on around them, I think that it loses some of that like elitist, like useless. The vestigial aspects of the language kind of get like shed as it gets adopted by new generations.
Yeah, so a couple things come up for me with that. The first thing I would ask is you said something to the effect of when we look at the origins of the term and then try to something about the context we're in today, that it doesn't look good for us. Could you expand on what you thought this, like what you thought about that, I guess?
Yeah. So I guess what I was referring to is kind of like there's like a classic debate that happens. I'm in the most like controversial one, because I think it illustrates the point the best. When people say, why did we fight the Civil War? Right? If we look at what was going on in the context of America at the time, then a lot of people would say, well, it's states' rights. But that would be like that's a limited viewpoint. In the same way that someone who is looking at it from modernity's perspective says it was about slavery, right? Isn't exclusively about either of those issues. It's about the two of those issues that are intertwined at that time, and understanding the nuances of those interconnected, or the interconnections between those two ideas, is what will give you the most like meaningful understanding of how we move forward, how we say like how not maybe like apologize, but like how we kind of reconcile those things together. So in that same way, with this is, I feel, much more benign than that particular discussion. In that same way, I would say if we look at where the phrase meaning of life comes from exclusively from the lens of modernity, we're just going to say like, oh, well, that was dumb. It was just an elitist way for people to say that like, oh, only artists can interpret the purpose of why we're here. But But if we look at it exclusively from their perspective, it's like it's kind of the same thing. Like neither one of those are really looking at like what has actually happened since the inception of that phrase into the zeitgeist of greater society.
Right. Yeah, I think the Civil War thing is a good example. That helps me understand what you mean, and I think I agree. It seems like we both agree that there is such a thing as responsible and irresponsible history. Like there is a responsible and an irresponsible way to do history, and that part of being a responsible historian is to not, well, you mentioned both directions of it, I guess, but yeah, on the one hand, to not read past things that weren't there, but also not to only look at what was going on, only look at one component of what was going on at the time either, in order to justify some more recent narrative that we're trying to kind of bolster or put forward.
That's a great way to put that, reinforcing that we're trying to bolster by taking with us like a particular definition of something. Like the way that we would understand racism today is completely different than the way that racism would have been understood in the Civil War, in the same way that like the way we would understand an individual's ability to like conceptualize what meaning might be or purpose might be, like that meant something completely different when that originally was written. It's like trying to compare religious practices when the Catholic Church only gave sermons in Latin to when the Catholic Church started giving, well, really the Protestant Church started giving services in the language that was spoken by the individuals who attended.
Right. And I have a word for one of those things that we talked about. I call it, I don't know if I've heard it somewhere or somebody else came up with it, it's possible, but I call it sock puppeting, where basically we reach back into the past and treat usually some famous person, right? Because we're doing this because we're trying to lend credibility. Instead of actually making a better argument, we're trying to do rhetorical tricks to lend ourselves credibility. So we go and reach back in the past and we pick up Socrates or something and we say, oh, Socrates said this or he said that. And that ultimately what to do is bolster the narrative that we're trying to support like now, which if it's not the case that Socrates was actually making some argument that we're trying to say, you know, he would be supportive of, that's a problem. You know, besides it being like deceitful, a lot of people, depending on where they're hearing this kind of stuff, won't do that extra step of trying to investigate whether or not that's the case or not. This is actually one of the major problems that the history of philosophy as a distinct discipline, I think, seeks to address. I think this is the most important jobs that it has. Like, there is a big debate about like when exactly the concept of a free will actually emerged, and like there was a long period, I don't know how long time, more assumed that we could go back into the past, Aristotle or Socrates or whatever, different people, and say, well, they're talking about the same thing we're talking about now when we talk about a free will. The guy makes a really compelling case to the contrary in a book it's just called A Free Will by a historian named Michael Freyd, where he basically makes he does this. I mean, it's very meticulous. It's important, you know, kind of early Greek, and basically looks at like, okay, well, here is when we can actually going at these texts, studying the discourse. We can actually see the concept of a will emerge, but we don't have that concept of a free will. And then he places the emergence of that concept in the Stoics. You know, I don't remember the exact. It's been a while since I read it. I don't remember. This is like a recurring problem in the way philosophy is presented, where we have like this anachronism of reading back into the past, and not just philosophy either. Also say this is a huge problem with the study of religion, major problem, because one of the things we do is we read back into the past relatively recent concept of a meaning of life, a certain meaning. We look back into the past to thousands of years ago, and we assume, well, obviously all these people's beliefs are false, or they're crazy, or they just don't have science, they don't have microscopes, or whatever the hell it is. So what they must be doing, they must actually be looking to create meaning in their lives. Like, I've actually heard people make this statements that, like, when certain, like, elders or shamans or whatever the term be for, like, certain indigenous groups would ingest, like, entheogens or psychedelics, you want to call them, they were somehow looking to create meaning in their lives. And I mean, just from what little I know about this kind of thing, it's not really what they were doing. I mean, from their perspective, when they were doing this, they were looking for truth, not meaning. They were looking for true things they could say about the state of the world they lived in that they could then bring back to the rest of their people to guide them. And I think we lose a lot by inserting into the past, because at the end of the day, it begs this question: actually, are we actually trying to learn about what people in the past thought and believed it, or some advance to?
Yeah. What comes to mind for me when you're bringing that stuff up is this idea that, like, when it rained, they created a god that brought rain, right? Like, to us, like, we're looking to explain a phenomena. Whenever something happens, we look for a reason why it happened. And we're just assuming that that's been the experience of humanity throughout the entirety of humanity's existence. And it's likely that that's just not the case. I think that this happens, like, in our everyday lives in a much more benign way. But people are really bad at the idea of, like, empathy, in my opinion. We'll assume that another individual is acting a certain way because they have a similar understanding of the way that the world works to us. And so if they do this thing, it must mean this thing because that's what it means to me. But that's just not the case. And I think that we have the same bad habit when it comes to history. When we do that, we're basically, like you said, sock puppeting or shoehorning in the ideas of modernity, the interpretations of life as we understand them currently, into the experiences of people in the past. But I don't think that we want to just try to live the experiences of people in the past either, because at that point it's just a story. It may as well be a fiction, in my opinion, because you're creating this facsimile of what that individual would have been going through based off of the knowledge that you have, which is ultimately insufficient to understand the entirety of all the contexts of what was going on back then. A great example of this that happens in, like, religion and the church is the verse in Corinthians where Paul says that women shouldn't speak in front of the church. And there's a bunch of Christians who want to interpret that as being like a blanket statement about women's ability to have a role in leadership, period. But, like, even if we do the thing that I was just talking about, where we just, like, try to only live in the experience of the people back in that time, we look at the context and we say, like, okay, well, there was an issue with this particular group of religious practitioners where women were in charge and they were doing these things that the church or Paul or Jesus or whoever, whatever you believe, didn't say or said didn't align with the teachings of Jesus. So those particular individuals shouldn't be in leadership because they are, like, false teachers. But even that is, like, facsimile, in my opinion, because you're assuming a bunch of things about what the experience of the individuals was back then in order to apply meaning to the text. And I think that really, like, that just shows that most texts, most religious documents, anything that's historical, really is, at best, it functions as, like, metaphor or proverbial knowledge, rather than something that's, like, concrete or guaranteed.
Real quick, can I just ask you guys, could you clarify how this historical kind of line of questioning is related to the topic, just for audience members who might be missing the connection.
Yeah, I think, well, there was something I was going to point out earlier, which is the specific article we're referring to called The Meaning of Life. It's in Philosophy. Now, Leitch and Tartini, I think are the name of the authors, and they locate the origin of the phrase "meaning of life" to a German romantic poet named Novalis, who was friends with philosophers sometime in the late, like very end of the 18th century. The line of questioning, I think, where I'm trying to go with this is where Koco said, like, something from that whole, like, sure, there might be something to that we want to be doing accurate history, or at least as accurate as we're able. And that, I think, begins first and foremost actually reading the writings, the philosophers we comment on, which lots of people just don't do. But to go on to say that, well, the lexicon is constantly changing, to kind of implying a major issue. It always is, but we've been discussing so far plenty of cases where it seems like we both agree that just because the lexicon may have changed, that this doesn't give us license to go and do, like, misreadings or irresponsible readings of text past. If that's the case, then if that's what's of life, which I think is ultimately a facet kind of putting forward, then why wouldn't we apply that same kind of gravity to this situation with the meaning of life would to any historical or ahistoricism? Further question?
Yeah, I think that is good. I think that I give them kind of move the discussion forward a little bit. You're okay with
it? Yeah, you are roboting a little bit on my end. I don't know if you are for anybody else, but
you were roboting a little bit on my end, so maybe it is me. How does it sound now?
You're fine. You sound good. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So the specific example that I brought up of Paul and Paul in quotations, assuming some guy named Paul wrote all of the epistles. Anyway, that's a whole different discussion. I don't think that we can like throw out that verse from the Bible and just say like, well, okay, we don't understand the historicity of it, so there's nothing to be gleaned from it. Or we could also throw it out by saying like, well, it doesn't apply to modern contexts because the historical contexts are no longer relevant, so we can't glean anything from it. I think that the better way to approach it is that perhaps there is something that is being said there that's deeper than what the face value words, whatever translation you're reading, say. So in my particular case, I've done a lot of thought and meditation on a lot of stuff in the Bible because it's been important to me throughout my life. I kind of came to the conclusion that what I could glean from that particular verse isn't a rule about who should and shouldn't be allowed to speak in front of individuals. It is a consideration of what kind of leadership should be in place in different contexts. If you're going to have a group of men who are all doing something like very specific, the most likely person who's going to be a good leader is someone who has experienced the same thing as them. And oftentimes that's going to be another man. The same thing would be true of women. Like if I were to go and try and discuss something that's like a female issue or a woman's issue from my perspective and try to lead women through that, I don't think that I would be able to as effectively solicit a desirable outcome as a woman would be able to. That's not to say that there aren't instances in which someone who has a different experience can provide good leadership or provide difference of opinion that's meaningful or worthwhile. It's just to say that, like, statistically speaking, it's most likely that you're going to find, or that the audience is going to find, something that resonates with them from a leader who has gone through what they've gone through, or who they relate to in a specific way, because of whether it be like a superfluous or a very profound connection that they feel to that person. And that could be as superfluous as we both have the same genitals, or we both present as the same gender, or as profound as, like, you have also gone to war, or you have also experienced sexism in the workplace. So I think that there's wisdom to be gleaned without just completely throwing out that particular verse. And I do think that, like, you just can't, right? There's too much, in this particular instance for, like, religion, there's just too much history for us to start saying, like, we're going to just cherry pick little bits and pieces out of there. And we're too well informed nowadays to do that. Like, back in King James Day, you could just retranslate the Bible and print a whole new copies, and by the time you can convince people to believe it, all the people who knew otherwise would be dead. But that's just not the case anymore. So I think that the same thing can be said of a lot of aspects of language, right? Like, we can't just, like, throw it out completely, because there's got to be someone who knows what that means and is curious as to why the phrase did or didn't evolve with us, or what it means now. I think that there's a natural, like, latent thing that happens within social interactions that makes it so that when you say, like, we should do away with this, it's much harder to do that. I mean, look how hard it is to convince people to stop saying the N-word, for crying out loud, you know?
So I guess I don't understand how the Bible fits in here, because you mentioned that we can't just throw out this verse because we either we don't understand what it meant then, what is no longer. I don't think like the history of philosophy up this phrase meaning of life originates. I think the opposite is true. I think we have access writings from the past. Concept was not present up until more or less specific point. These previous contexts are still relevant. Like, they're not made relevant only by anachronistically inserting this concept back into the past. I guess I don't understand how that example, throwing out a contemporary concept. And lastly, when you're talking about the question of why it's evolved over time, I mean, it's anyone's guess. My hypothesis, though, and this is really just because of how meaning actually operates, I think the reason that this concept caught on, I mean, they told it in the article, but I think the reason it caught on was just because it was available. Like, it was presented to us, actively assign meaning to it. Like, we've got this phrase, and we just, there must be some reason to mean something. Into, especially for reading, like, maybe it speaks to the kind of elitism. We kind of just go into reading some of the, like, high, so-called, like, higher literature or whatever, just assuming that what we're reading actually is meaningful, without stopping to ask, does this phrase actually have some meaning? Like, is there, where did this person pick this up from? And this is so rare. Like, I think the reason I harp on this so much is, first, there's not many other scholars doing this. In fact, most of the other scholars that have started talking about this article, is frustrating. It's so rare to actually have, like, a moment that, like, somebody says, like this. It's very rare to pinpoint like that down to where a concept may have entered into the discourse. Like, that's But I think ultimately the reason we use it is pretty much arbitrary. Like going to the thing you talked about with empathy, like I thought that was a good example of kind of what I'm talking about with like this retro thing, writing from like when we see it in um,
Sorry, Varsity, you cut out there for a bit. Could you repeat your last sentence, maybe?
Actually, the last sentence, like, what?
Oh, I thought we lost you for a
Can
second.
you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Last sentence I said was that I was planning to follow, so that was it.
Gotcha. I missed a couple of things that you said because there was some breakup. But I think I got the gist of it. I want to clarify. I'm not trying to like rip on the article to say that it like didn't do anything. I feel like it was actually a really good assessment of like should we allow this phrase to continue to be a part of the way that we look at things. And I think that you bring up this idea, you've been kind of like repeating it. So I think it feels like it's important where it creates a default way of looking at something from the past as if it intrinsically had meaning to it, the same meaning then that it does now. Did I understand that correctly?
Well, yeah, I would go a step further and say it didn't up until some point in history. They got it wrong. It clearly emerged at some point and probably rather late.
Yeah, according to the article, the phrase is less than 250 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that we run into the same issue with the way that the Bible's interpreted, right? Like the idea of fundamentalism is less than 200 years old. The idea that God created the earth in 7 24-hour days, that's like a concept that's less than 200 years old, that's completely spawned out of like anthropological reasoning, not out of and social necessity for the people at the time, for the historicity of what they were experiencing, in my opinion. But I don't think that means that we should throw out that interpretation as like not being purposeful at all. I think that we just need to understand the contexts of it better. Like if your point is that we shouldn't take the phrase meaning of life and apply it to all of the literature that exists before the phrase was incepted, then I agree with you. But I didn't feel like that was what the prompt was saying.
Sorry. How to stream a yeah, and I set that aside because what I'm hearing where you're insisting that there's still some purpose. I mean, obviously, I think you're talking about there's still some purpose today. Like, even if it would be anachronistic to read it back into the past, that says nothing about whatever use it may have currently, which I would agree. However, this brings me back to that initial line of questioning that we were kind of mulling over a few days ago on here, which is like, hey, saying we're signifying this phrase, but everything that we seem to be signifying with it is just others that's due to experiment, and it just begs the question of like kind of superfluous term, like it reduces down to the purpose of life, the reason life exists, value of life, then they're all coherent that could be argued for. I'm not sure this phrase actually does much else other than act as some kind of unnecessary mediator between us and these other phrases that it ultimately reduces down to. So I see basically two possibilities. One is that it does in fact just reduce down to something like the reason for life's being, the purpose of life, etc. There is instinct that we're trying to express with the phrase meaning of life, distinct from life's purpose and for being, life's whatever. Those are the two possibilities that I see.
Yeah. Well, I feel like when you say that to conflate meaning of life with purpose of life, to say that those two things aren't interchangeable, I feel like you're looking more at like explicitly the origination of the phrase rather than the evolution of the phrase. And I think that kind of falls into that category of taking a particular like lens back, and as you've been saying, like anachronistically interpreting the original intent of the phrase. Like I think that the article that you sent, as much as it brought up a lot of good points, it kind of does do something very similar to what I was talking about earlier, where it says like, this is our understanding of what was going on at the time. This is my interpretation as a thinker in my own current temporality and context of what was most likely happening when the phrase was written and why it gained popularity.
Well,
But
yeah,
that
that's just how
individual who's claiming
history
that didn't like
doing history works. That's just what is entailed by doing history. Of course, we're never. We
I
need to have,
lost you after you said, of course we're never.
of course, a complete. If the bar is so high that we from historians something like a fallible complete picture of the past, then we can toss out history as a discipline is not historians are capable of. So I don't know that's full to it because any.
I apologize. I'm having some connectivity issues. Hold on one second here.
I think it's on Varsity's end and not yours.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good to know. Yeah, I just disconnected and reconnected trying to see because I keep on missing like half of his sentences.
Yeah, me
he's
too.
cutting out.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, but you're still breaking up a little bit.
Yeah, you're like his circle will go on, but I hear nothing. Is Heaven's Gate coming to get you?
I don't know. I don't have control over my internet connection.
Let's go over. You're saying that
Becomes
you think that if we applied that kind of criteria to any historical concept, we would be doing something wrong. Could you go into that again, maybe?
Well, yeah. I mean we can make the same objection to pretty much any historical anything.
Mm-hmm.
At which point,
but does that mean?
History.
Yeah, we completely lost you again.
Maybe try bouncing out and coming back in. Press the restart button.
Coco, while he's figuring out his internet, maybe you could respond to that though. Like, why can't we apply that kind of criteria to any historical concept that you propose?
Yeah. I do agree that to kind of just like blanketly say, well, we're just understanding things from our own like lens of modernity and trying to interpret based on contexts that we don't understand. I do agree that kind of like undermines the entirety of history, but like at the same time, I'm not super opposed to a consistent undermining of our interpretation of history. I think that history is a lot like science in that we can't really ever say anything for certain, you know? Without me having been in Pompeii when it happened, surviving and coming back to tell it now, like I'm just not going to understand all of the nuances that go into everyday life. It's kind of like, like time capsules, right? Like in 100 years, if someone opens up, actually it'd be in like 60 years, if someone opens up the Nickelodeon time capsule, there's plenty of like records. There's even more records now than there were 100 years ago with like videos and all that stuff for people to understand like why things are put inside of a time capsule, why they're important. But without having like lived with those things, experienced them in your everyday life, I don't think that you can make a draw a conclusion that says like this is absolutely the way that it was. You
Well,
can't say
I don't
something
think
that's
that
like
one is trying to draw. It's just that
mhm.
given the information we have access to now, this is the best explanation we can come up with. If somebody wants to take issue with that explanation or wants to present information to the contrary, that's fine. But I don't see how this isn't leading to basically a rejection of any historical account anyone could give about anything on the basis that they can never give an infallible picture of it.
When I would say, yeah, we can't just reject something because, oh, it's not totally true. We can't just say, like, oh, there's like an element of this that is untrue in some capacity, so it means nothing. I don't think that that's like what we're trying to get at when we're having linguistic interactions with each other or interpretive interactions with the past. But what I guess what I'm trying to say is that even though we can't, or because we can't, like, completely in an infallible way interpret the intent or the context or whatever it is that's going on for that particular phrase. Like we weren't living inside the head of the author when they wrote it, or inside of the publisher's head when they were deciding to publish it, or whoever was promoting it. Ultimately, if we go back and look at the context and say, like, this is just an aspect of elitism that like is perpetuated amongst the upper class because it sold books, like sure, that might be one aspect of it, but it might be the case also that the author who wrote it never intended it for it to be that way. It's kind of like there's this episode of Rick and Morty where they're on the giant station that has all of the Ricks and all of the Mortys on it, and there's like a manufacturing plant that makes these cookies that capture the essence of an experience, and like there's this whole plot where one of the Ricks gets to like escape and he thinks he's really going to be free from manufacturing cookies every day, and they capture the essence of that feeling and put it in the cookie. Like the original intention of that essence, the original intention of that feeling was sincere, that there was freedom, but it gets mutated by somebody else's predatory purposes for the sake of their own agenda. So like it might be the case that that author wrote it with the intent of doing all the things that this particular person who wrote the article in this case says that they did, but it might also, it's just as likely in my opinion that it's the case that that wasn't the intent. I think that we can hold in the same hand both of those interpretations and say like, well, okay, if we know that this phrase only exists from a certain point, a certain temporality on, then maybe we need to reassess how we're looking at things that go, or reassess how we're looking at things that were before that prior to having examined this particular bit of knowledge. But it doesn't mean that we just need to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
So I don't want to dwell too much on this, but it does seem
Mm-hmm.
like on the one hand you're saying, no, I'm not arguing that like infallibility is the criteria that we should expect from any historical account, but then you're going on to basically say exactly that.
Well, let me see if I can clarify. When I say infallibility is the criteria for us drawing a conclusion, what I'm saying is that like we can not have infallibility and still say I draw value from this particular thing. But I don't think that we should not have infallibility and then say this is the way that it was. Like I could say it is a very reasonable interpretation, a very well-backed interpretation, or a likely very close to the truth interpretation if I read this way, understanding all the contexts that were present at the time that it was written. That's a very likely reason to believe what it is that I believe about this particular thing. But I think
Yeah,
that
that's what any historian, that's the extent of what any historian is saying. That's all they're saying. They're not trying to, I mean, and the authors of this article are not really talking a lot at all about the intentions behind, you know, this phrase's coinage. Like, they're not really even speculating about that at all. They're just describing when and how and maybe why contextually it arose, where it did, when it did, but they're not
Mhm.
really speculating about the intentions of any of the actors.
Sure. But I guess what I'm not understanding is like where the connection comes from of like, okay, we have like a reasonable understanding of where this came from potentially, so we should just throw it out completely. Not understanding how we're going from one to the other. Or at least that's what I'm
Well,
arguing against, is that we shouldn't throw it out completely.
um, well, it should make us be more skeptical about whether or not the fact that we talk about it is just arbitrary. Like it just entered, I mean, it entered in from some depressed poet, like just saying something. Like, I mean, only the artist can divine the meaning of life is the exact quote from Novalis.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
yeah, okay, that's just how poetry is. It's not like he's making a falsifiable claim or subjecting it to experimentation. That's
Right.
not what we expect from poetry. That's fine,
No.
but it's almost as if we are treating it like that is almost how we treat it today. Like it has some
Mm.
real
Okay,
meaning. And
real quick.
going back to what
I just want to say we've reached the hour mark, and I'd like to get on to the question of is it a useful concept as well? Because I feel like we're going a little bit in circles with the meaning part, and then maybe we can come back to that at the question segment at the end. I just want to make sure before it gets too long that we address the use part of it. Is the idea like does it have the idea of the meaning life? Does it have some kind of use value or like practical value, even though it might be incoherent in some sense? What do you think, Coco? Why don't you start us off with this one?
I actually, honestly, I had an example that I thought was really useful for this particular question. So I think it works either way. Unless Varsity had something else on the last subject that he wanted to finish up on.
no, as I think it ties into what where we're moving
Moving
into.
towards. Yeah, yeah. So there's an interpretation that a lot of people had of the book series Lord of the Rings, where they thought that Tolkien was writing about the atom bomb, and the One Ring was an atom bomb, or a representation of the atom bomb. But if you have any familiarity with Lord of the Rings, it's published, I think, a couple decades before. I think it's published in the 30s. It's published before maybe not published, it's completed, right? So the publication process was already happening by the time the atom bomb dropped, or it was published before. I can't remember off the top of my head right now, which is very embarrassing because I'm a very big Tolkienite. Anyway, whole different thing. Um, and Tolkien is like interviewed afterwards, and he's like, "No, I had no idea that the atom bomb even existed when I wrote about this. I wrote all of these books in like the 1910s through 20s, started the publication process, and then it gets published. Like it just happens to coincide with this particular thing." That might not be the author's original intent, right? But like that doesn't mean that it's not valuable for me to maybe look at the story and say like, oh, where are these interesting parallels? What is this new interesting way of interpreting the story that gives it like new meaning or new something new and exciting to it that otherwise wouldn't have existed if I had just said like, okay, I sat down and read it exactly the way that the author intended me to read it. I think that that's like part of what happens with art is that it goes into the hands of a bunch of other interpreters. I think that's one of the beautiful things about art.
Okay.
I would even make the argument that
Um,
like the phrase meaning of life in some capacity, like you said we don't expect poetry to be coherent. Like, I don't think that it's intended to be like an empirically measurable thing. I think that it's intended to have a particular use. And it may have been the case that when it was written, it was intended to be used by certain individuals for a certain reason, but that doesn't mean that other individuals can't latch onto it and use it in a better capacity.
I guess I would agree. Although I'm not sure where this connects to the meaning of life stuff.
Oh, I think we were moving into talking about whether or not the phrase has some usefulness, even if it lacks total coherence.
Well, I guess I'm not sure why it would. And I don't know that it's the coherence, like that might be one way of putting it, but I don't know if that really captures all of the problem. Like for me, like I've said a few times, I'm still kind of looking for an answer on this, is if this phrase just reduces down to some other phrase, why we have this one, like why we're so insistent on keeping it. Especially if the other phrases that it reduces down to seem to actually capture something more or less clear. Like it's clear to me what it would mean for life to have a purpose. It would mean that there is some purpose for life existing, right? Or alternatively, if you want to cash it out differently, maybe there is some purpose toward which we're supposed to be striving by virtue of something, some reason for why life was created. That conveys something meaningful to me. Whether or not it's true, that's a secondary issue, but it conveys something that I can actually think about and discern whether or not it makes sense, whether or not it's correct. And I guess I'm still wondering then what exactly this phrase meaning of life is useful for, if it's basically just acting as a middleman for these other, and I think more expressive phrases. Or as I said earlier, and I still haven't really gotten a clear answer on, like, is there something else, something distinctive that we are trying to say with this phrase? Something that doesn't reduce down to life's purpose, life's reason for existing, etc. Like, those are the two possibilities I see. And if, like, I think having an answer to that question is tied into whatever use the concept might have.
Yeah, I can understand that. I think I don't really have like an explanation that I think fits like the bill of like academic philosophic discipline, right? It's more of just like an appeal to the authority of my own personal experience, so anecdotal, right?
That's fine.
Yeah, I think the phrase "there's a bunch of ways to skin a cat" is kind of applicable here. I think that because the meaning of life is a phrase that has been socialized enough into the zeitgeist of our experience of modernity, that it, even if it can be reduced down to like other phrases, that doesn't mean that we should just say that, well, the meaning of life is useless. We should just say the purpose of life. I think this also kind of correlates to the idea of the way that we interact with language, right? So like when we talked about at the very beginning of this, we said like, what does meaning mean to you? You know, and you said it's a relationship. I said it's this or that. And like I Googled because I was trying to see if purpose was just a synonym for meaning. It's not. The two definitions of meaning that are like dictionary definitions really like would, in my opinion, they would make this sentence not work. It doesn't function, right? Because there's no definition of, well, there's a definition of life, but then like the meaning of life sentence would literally mean like, what is the definition of life? Because that's essentially what the dictionary definition says, is that it is a definition. Meaning is a definition. The two are conflated. So I think that the way that people use it, like we were talking about earlier, the syntax of it changes the connotations of the word meaning here and turns it into something of what is the purpose of life. And I think that just because we would say like, oh, well, that one word's not as good as the other one, we should just get rid of it or not consider it. I don't think that that's what would
I have
happen.
a
I
hard
think that
time believing then that there isn't something distinctive we think we're inserting by using this word, because if it really just does reduce down to that, to something else, then it seems like there's probably something else we have in mind by it, something beyond a purpose or a
right, but
reason,
I think
whatever.
this goes back to the historicity of the phrase in itself as well, where we're saying this is what meaning means to us now. This is the way that we use meaning colloquially. Like we don't have a dictionary or the like insight of an individual who was interacting with other people on a regular basis when that phrase was originally coined or incepted. It could be the case that meaning meant purpose then, and that now we're just kind of like we've lost that particular the context of that particular word, and so the
Well,
phrase has
no,
shifted.
because I think part of what went on was that Novalis was hanging out with other philosophers who were starting to get interested in the philosophy of language. They were starting to get into meaning in a linguistic sense and how that relates to philosophy. I think that's one of the interesting things about where this phrase originated from and who it originated with. But I don't want to get sidetracked on that again.
Yeah.
Because you wanted to focus on throwing the baby out with the bathwater, i.e., not doing that. And I guess for me, I would almost put it inversely. I would ask, what are we losing by keeping this word around, this phrase around? Um, I think that it's a case of something accomplished in, maybe there's exceptions to this. I'm open to that. But I think a lot of where I see this phrase being kind of thrown around in like pop philosophy discourse is it seems to kind of accomplish almost exactly the opposite of what ostensibly people are trying to accomplish with it. Namely, it seems to be kind of alienating us from ourselves. Like, just as it's acting as a mediator for these other phrases that do essentially the same job, it's sort of mediating between us and this life we're living, where it's this weird kind of additional thing being kind of placed in between me and my life, and I guess I'm not understanding what we gain by having that happen.
Like what we gain by keeping the phrase.
Mm-hmm.
I think we gain a level of accessibility for individuals to consider uh, consider what that means for them. I know that we're talking about like meaning as not having the original context or what have you, and that like when we use the phrase "what is the meaning of life," like we're not actually. I don't think anyone's actually talking about meaning the way that meaning is defined today. I think that it's one of those like colloquial. It becomes one of those colloquial things. I don't think that there is like when you say what is the sorry, there's a crow cawing above me. I'm outside. Last time I was on here, there were fucking bats, and now there's crows.
Yeah.
I should stop hanging out outside. But no, you keep on bringing up this point of like, well, if it's just an intermediary for this particular word, then like, why should we bother keeping it? Do we lose something from it? I mean, I don't think that we gain or lose anything by, or sorry, I don't think we gain anything by getting rid of it, and I think we lose something by getting rid of it. I think that we lose a certain level of accessibility for individuals who are just like, some people's gateway into the discipline of philosophy is literally they got high. Like, are those individuals necessarily the ones that we should take at like face value as having something really valuable to add? That is still weird. Why is this thing calling? Anyway, sorry. This crow is just like incessantly cawing. You guys can't hear it, can you?
No.
Okay. You sound like a fucking Edgar Allan Poe right now. The Raven. No, but I think that we lose something because we lose a certain level of accessibility for individuals to have a gateway into the discussion. Something that you've brought up a lot is that by having this phrase around, we misappropriate it into our interpretations of things in the past. I think the fact that we can even bring it up as a misappropriation is something that's valuable in some capacity, because now we can really like incept a conversation of like, what is the reason that this person wrote this thing? Like, are we interpreting it correctly? Is the lens that we're looking at this through, is it useful? You know?
Right. So one of the issues I see with this is that the narrative that I think is trying to be like bolstered today is premised on precisely this idea that the meaning of life is something we've always been thinking about. And this narrative, this idea that, the story is pretty familiar. We enter modernity and somehow we've lost contact with the things in our lives that gave our lives meaning or whatever. Like there's this narrative that up till some point we derived meaning from all these things, whether it's religion or whatever, and now we've lost contact with this. But if the phrase the meaning of life didn't even enter into discourse until like 1798, well, that's a pretty damn long time for us to supposedly be in contact with these things that exist for the purpose of giving our lives meaning, a thing which was not conceptualized until much later. So it's, I guess, kind of like the fantasy of the lost object with Lacan, right? This idea that we've lost something, but we never really had it to begin with. So we couldn't lose it, not because we still have it, but because it just was not the case. Why would someone forward a narrative like that? I think the answer is pretty simple, because then it allows people to get on YouTube, write books, sell packages or whatever, and say, you've lost contact with the things that are giving your life meaning, blah, 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 but I've come to the rescue. I've come up with the new philosophical system to save you. But no. I'm not trying to create a new religion. I'm not doing that. I'm just giving you literally a set of things you should do now that I base on nothing, that I base on literally an ahistorical account of something. This is kind of where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
I'm trying really not to name names too, because
I appreciate that.
I think there's enough examples of this that shouldn't be necessary.
No, and I would agree. Yeah.
Okay. Do you also see a problem with this?
I mean, in the same way that I would have seen a problem with the way that people practiced medicine prior to the existence of the American Medical Association, right? Like, I don't know. There's a book that I read in one of my philosophy classes, ironically enough. It's like Charlatans or something like that, or Snake Oil Science. And it's basically like the perspective of this, or it's a story told from the perspective of this historical figure. He was a guy who went around the United States claiming that he could cure impotence and a couple other things in men by cutting them open and putting a goat testicle inside of their skin and then stitching it shut. And so basically he would just go from town to town, collect money from the people who were wealthy enough to afford the procedure, and then leave before they died of sepsis. And the success of his campaign was a major reason that we have the American Medical Association in the first place, because he wasn't the only one doing that. Like Coca-Cola used to put like actual freaking drugs inside of their stuff and claim it was a medicinal tonic. Like, I think that this is the same thing. It's just in different clothes. Like to say we've lost some sort of like Well, okay. I don't even need to go there. You already said it accurately. I don't need to repeat it. The reason I'm saying it's something it's the same thing but in different clothes is because of the way that like psychology, for instance, right? Psychology as a practice, as a scientific practice, as a soft science, right? It's only been around. It hasn't even been around for 200 years. Like we don't get Freud, if I remember correctly, until the 1900s, right? Am I an idiot or am I remembering my dates right?
No, that's about right.
Yeah. So like now we've got this whole new way in which we're interpreting and trying to understand individuals' behavior, and we're trying to shoehorn it into everything. And so of course there's going to be people who are going to co-opt it. They're going to co-opt it in the same way that religion was co-opted, in the same way that science is co-opted. This is just another shade of a cycle in history, in my opinion.
Okay, but why do you think that guy who was sewing the goat balls into the people's stomachs or whatever he was doing, like, why do you think he was? I mean, part of why he was successful must have been people's ignorance about how medicine like actually works. Like that is just not science, right?
Yeah. I mean, in the same way that preyed upon biological ignorance, I think that when individuals co-opt, and I wouldn't say that it's just the meaning of life phrase. I think that this is like a systemic issue with the way that people are trying to cope with the consequences of modernity. People are ignorant to the way in which they could better their lives, in my opinion. And it becomes very, very easy to just place the blame onto something external. Like, I was raised in a time where I lack connectivity to the earth, so I should run a copper wire from from my mattress to the ground outside. Like, that's actually a scientifically backed woo-woo thing. There's like a whole double-blind study that they did on it, but it's just my example of like, I think there are people who would claim like, oh, it used to be the case that there were like great men that would give out these things, and now we've lost the connection to great men because of the fact that those great men now have to like work a 9 to 5 every day.
Okay,
I
but
think
so the
that
reason,
it's all the same kind of stuff.
no, and I agree, and that's why I'm kind of zeroing in on that. The reason I asked why this guy was able to be successful, and assuming it has something to do with, I wouldn't even say it's just ignorance, but like this, like at a time, like the degree to which something is enigmatic and mysterious, like
Yeah.
changes as we learn more about it. I think what we're seeing with the meaning of life thing, like as it's like commodified into this like basically this glittering generality kind of thing,
Yeah.
um, is precisely because the phrase is so freaking vague. Because it can whatever you want it to mean. I can make it mean that, like I was posting earlier, screw it. The meaning of life is it's bees. It's, looking at bees, beekeeping, that's the meaning of life. I mean, why not? I mean, I can make it whatever I want. I can sell some book about that or some, Patreon thing, that'll teach you how to become more like a bumblebee, like because this is part of my
Interestingly
issue.
enough,
No, go ahead.
no, go. Oh, I was just going to make a funny anecdote. You're making an actual point.
Well, I think where you mentioned like this consequences of modernity thing, I think that's part of the narrative. But I think what it leaves
Yeah.
out, it and maybe I'm being a little, maybe I would be, I don't want to be too hard on it. So let me say at least that there's something that's being left out, which is
Yeah.
that a lot of the things that people identify as like, oh my God, it's modernity. Oh no. Like the things people typically list under that is like, oh, we've lost contact with like religion or whatever. But like,
Mm-hmm.
this is not a new problem. Like there have always been people questioning like religious doctrine. I mean, like you can make the
Yeah.
case that philosophy quite literally begins with people
Because of
starting
that.
to say, Yeah, like, hey, I'm gonna find things out about the world myself. I'm not just gonna rely on what Homer and Hesiod have written in their poems. Like, I'm gonna go out and make my own inquiry into nature, find things out myself. Even earlier than that, like, you look at, like, you brought up the Bible. I mean, you look at, like, the book of Ecclesiastes. That's a very strange book, right? Because it's literally a guy arguing with God basically and complaining a lot about God. And
Yeah.
you see that too in like in the Bhagavad Gita, like the inciting incident basically of the Gita is this guy questioning everything that his religion has taught him. This is like 3,000 years ago. So like this
Yeah.
whole idea that like, and I mean, maybe not everyone is, that's not what everyone means when they talk about like modernity and its consequences. But I mean, would you agree that there are enough examples of people that are essentially making this claim that like criticizing and questioning religious doctrine is somehow some like new thing that we only started doing like 100 years ago or something?
I think that this gets back to that idea of like the study of history, right? We don't do it very well. I think that we have and this is just like a something that I postulate, right? It's not, I don't think it's backed. I hope it'd be nice if there was a genius out there who cited it and had a reason for it. But anyway, I think that we have an evolutionary prerogative as individuals to prove that our experience of the world is the most visceral and human experience of the world to have ever existed. It's like it's why a lot of our parents, right, they will say like things changed and it's bad. They'll talk about like the homosexual agenda or whatever talking point is on Fox News most recently, and then beseech you as the younger individual to say like, no, we should keep it the way that it was, as if the way that it was like the best way, or as if their critique of the way that things are becoming is the only time that anyone has ever critiqued the way that things have become, as if they didn't experience the same exact thing with their parents. And we have this natural, latent ability to just forget that there are thousands of years of context behind us. And I don't think that there's a way to mitigate. I think that's just a natural function of the way that society evolves. It's like that quote that people will like often put up in a meme. It's like the youth of today are lazy and they don't think about anything and blah 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 blah. Who do you think said that? And it's like Plato, 2000 BC or whatever shit. Like it's the same thing. I think that patterns repeat themselves. That's part of why I brought up the idea of like people co-opting the phrase meaning of life as just the modern day snake oil science, because now we actually have legislation that prevents them from doing it biologically. Now they have to do it in a way that's like less, or that's more esoteric. And I think that like if we look at the way that businesses are capitalizing on the same concept. I mean, I don't know if you get them, but I get a ton of BetterHelp ads on YouTube. I get like
Oh
advertising
God, yeah.
everywhere. Yeah, dude, everywhere for telehealth, for like all for counseling. I was getting for a little while advertising that specifically said, you can call us, we'll give you a prescription for ADHD medication. Like, I think that if you look at the way that society moves and the way that business moves in our current context, you'll see the cycles are the same. They're not any different. And I don't think that they were any different back when like the glorification of Greek culture, right? Like part of the reason that we even have books by Plato and Aristotle and all that is because there was like a Hellenistic movement either prior to or right at the end of the medieval era. But like there's tons of books of wisdom from like all sorts of different places of Europe and thousands of years of culture that just get burnt down and eradicated by the Catholic Church because they're not part of the like approved lexicon of the church or of the individuals in power. And there's a bunch of individuals in power who decide that Greek culture and Greek ideas should stick around. So that's why we have them. Like if it weren't for that, we'd have probably as many publications from like Norse wisdom as we do from Greek wisdom. But like as it is, we don't even have a complete textual understanding of what Norse mythology was. Like we have the Eddas, but that's it. That's literally the only thing. And there's
Right.
no way that's a monolith of what, like that's not a monolith of what everything was doing.
So it sounds like we're in agreement on at least a couple of things, meaning
Yeah.
namely that the meaning of life, maybe it means something, maybe it doesn't. Whatever it does mean is rather vague. This vagary about it is that a word?
It is
Whatever.
now.
The vagueness of it is very easy to capitalize on in ways that are not necessarily beneficial. And you even said it yourself, this is something that is very difficult to even mitigate because this is just what people do with glittering generalities. This is just what is done with them. You also brought up this, this idea of some special, some exceptionalism about like the Western canon. This like
Yeah.
this is so unbelievably common with this type of like meaning of life stuff
Mhm.
that I've been exposed to at least. I don't know if you've been exposed to some of the same things, but one of the things that really sticks out to me, going back to like the ahistoricism thing, but also bringing it into the present because these are narratives that are being pushed today. Is this idea that like we can kind of take this like floating signifier of the meaning of life, we paste it onto, sure, the Western stuff, we paste it onto Socrates. Socrates' search for wisdom becomes the search for meaning. No argument is given, we just assert that and people accept it. That's fine apparently. But then when we start saying like the search for, God in like Christianity, the worship of God, this is just people trying to create meaning in their lives. Also, screw it, why not? The Buddha and the search for enlightenment, that's also a search for the meaning of life. Now we have a new problem with that. We don't just have the problem of we're reading something into the past. We're now reading something into the past that we're kind of using as an umbrella over three very distinct projects, with the implication being that all three of these projects are themselves interchangeable with one another. Now, besides this just being bad history, I don't know if you've encountered it, but since coming on to Discord, I've encountered it a lot.
Varsity, you are breaking up again.
Yeah, I honestly, it's really funny. He's roboting, but like I still heard dip dip dip, quasi-intellectual dip dip fascism, but dip, dip. So I think I'm getting the gist
Forget
of what he's saying.
perennialism. That was a bit.
Perennialism.
Varsity, are you still there?
Varsity, I would leave and come back. That helped last time. And then Coco, I think you heard enough to respond to that question, so go ahead.
Yeah. I'll just try to remember what I say so that I can repeat it when he gets back. Yeah, I think that what it sounds like to me is that the issue here isn't necessarily with the phrase. And I don't think that eliminating the phrase, I think that's the point that I'm trying to make, is that eliminating the phrase isn't going to eliminate this problem. I think this is an inevitable cycle that occurs within any kind of like thought practice or religious practice or interpretive practice. I think this is an inevitable cycle that people are going to think that like, or use these things in a predatory way. That's part of why I brought up the whole like the guy who was going around putting goat balls inside of people. Like, this is just inevitable. So it's not an issue with the phrase necessarily. Like, I think that the phrase adds enough that it should stick around. I think the issue is with like, the issue is with the system itself and with individuals who operate within it. Because like, just really quickly, when you talk about like Lacan and Jung, or you didn't mention Jung, but Jung is kind of like, Jung and Lacan, they hang out in the same apartment building, right? Or like Sartre is another good example of this. A lot of people will. What was that?
I don't know if Jung and Lacan are hanging out.
Well, they're in the same apartment building. They might not like each other, but they're in the same apartment building, in my opinion. Even though they have vastly different goals, but they're both psychoanalytics who look at, the thing that is intangible experience. Is that noumena? I think it's noumena. They both look at like noumena.
In Lacan, he calls it the real.
Yeah. Anyway, lost my train of thought there for a second. Hold on. The system issue. I think that like if you were to actually read into what those individuals might have to say about meaning or purpose in life, they actually have a lot of valuable stuff to say about it. Like even Sartre, who's an existentialist, who would say that like there is nothing intrinsically has meaning, that it's just like meaning that you give things. Like I think even that as a practice is valuable. I think that when you look at Stoicism and understand the context of what was going on at the time and think, I'm going to practice Stoicism, you're not going to practice it the way that they practiced it. But that doesn't mean that you're not taking enough from it for it to like still be Theseus's ship in the end. And I think that there are certain practices in Stoicism that happen to coincide with really prosperous habits for individuals now. So I wouldn't say let's just throw out Stoicism because there was a few things in there that could be used in like a predatory fashion, or that the contexts of them don't make any sense now, or what have you. Like I would say that if you find value in it, then you should
But that's
like,
not
continue
really
to use it.
That's not really the extent of my criticism of the phrase meaning of life. Is not that there are some useful things about it, but then there's also these other issues, so we should throw it out. My position is, I mean, may sound rather extreme, but my position is that I don't see any use for it. And on top of that, I see all of these nefarious ways it can be used to bolster nonsense at the one end, and dangerous ideologies at the more extreme end. But I was gonna say that I wanted to try and wrap things up a little bit by
Yeah, I'm getting towards the end of my
I think
time
that
too.
we should, real
I would-
quick, I also would like to just give some people a little bit of time for questions, if that's okay.
Okay.
Well, that's what I meant. I wanted to concede on the point of throwing out the phrase entirely. I want to give that to Coco. But I would ask one final question, which is, do you agree that given what we've discussed, and we seem to agree on some of these issues that we highlighted, would you
Yeah.
agree that there's presently a dearth of more critical inquiry into what exactly we're saying when we say this phrase, and that having conversations like this is at least worthwhile to that end?
Like the conversation that we just had?
Yeah, and conversations like it.
Yeah, I think also I just want to compliment you. I haven't had to look up a word during a debate in a long time, and I haven't heard the word dearth used like ever. So just like great diction, dude, honestly. I know that sounds flagrant. I don't mean it to be. Sincerely, thank you. You gave me a new word to use. I wouldn't say that there's necessarily an inadequate amount of information out there that's available. Like I could just go Google Lacan on meaning, and I'll get a bunch of stuff on what he has to say literally about the meaning of life. Like if I type in Lacan on meaning, it comes up with Lacan on the meaning of life, like, or Lacan on the meaning of death.
I mean, I would be suspicious I don't think Lacan thinks there's a meaning of life. He doesn't even think you and I exist.
He has a thing about death and how it's actually really beautiful. I can't remember the phrase. It was very poetic and really nice, as most of what Lacan says is poetic and really nice. But yeah, I would agree with you. I don't think he necessarily has a meaning of life, but I think that there is a reasonable interpretation for individuals to go into it and say like, oh, I could use this in my daily life. I think that there's an adequate amount of information out there. I think that people don't care to look for it, honestly. I think that the reason that these like predatory issues exist within our system is because individuals aren't willing to do the things that are, like, in my opinion, right? This is just my opinion, aren't willing to do the things that are necessary to actually improve their lives. They're willing to say that the reason that I'm unhappy is because women have been taught to, referencing the incel movement here, right? That women have been taught to only have sex with these particular kind of men, and I'm not one of those kind of men, so the world has been woefully unfair to me. So, like, rather than look at yourself and say, like, well, the only common factor between me and all these women who I've tried to sleep with is me, you're willing to defer the responsibility of that out to somebody else. And the same thing, I think, is applicable in, like, religion. In most modern practices, like, you're willing to just defer the responsibility of your actions out to something else. Well, I sin because I'm human, or like I treat this person badly because God says that they shouldn't do this particular thing. You're just deferring the responsibility and obfuscating the actual problem by leaning on this crutch. And I don't think that there's any amount of information or any amount of phrases that we could get rid of or any amount of thought control that we could do that would actually make people have an inclination to do the things that would make their life better, because it's really fucking hard to do that.
Okay, so I really want to get to the questions because some people are biting at the, what is the word, the phrase, biting at the bullet, chomping at the bit. Yeah, I'm combining it with some others. I always do that. I'm so
bite
bad.
the bullet,
Bite the bullet, and chomping at the bit. I just combine them. But
it's really funny. There's a specific word that describes mixing aphorisms together, and I can't remember what it is, but it's hilarious.
I have that problem. So I think Control Alt Delete. It sounded like you had a question. Would you like to ask them? All right. He says, I thought debate was about meaning of life, but you said it was general. Is general the same as no meaning?
I'm not sure.
Do you see his question in the scheduled debate?
I
Yeah,
see it.
I don't. We don't know what you mean, Control Alt Delete.
Well, let's
I have like I guess a
go ahead,
question,
Josh, while he fixes.
Okay, sure. Maybe I'm reading too much into some of what you said, Varsity, but do you think maybe like a critique of meaning is that it's sort of like depreciates things, like what could be called a things like intrinsic or its immanent value over something that's sort of transcendent? In a sense, like we say, like if something is, and then it also, in a parallel way, it also makes things that are intrinsically worthless more valuable, or things that should be intrinsically improved more valuable because we assign them as a transcendent value of meaning to them. And this is maybe ties to some my ideologies like Nietzsche or whatever influence. But do you think that this could be like a point of, like, say maybe Marx would say, like medium, meaning like I guess religion at his time would be like a sort of opium of the people, where we because we assign like meaning in our toil, we don't really change our circumstances, or we when we do find something meaningful, we depreciate the things that could be meaningful in their own, not in a meaningful but like valuable in their own right, just imminently, just because of what they not transcendently from something outside of it. We depreciate that because it doesn't have this transcendent value. Like in a weird way, like nihilism almost comes from meaning rather than like the lack of it.
Oh,
Sorry, that's a bit loaded, or me putting a bunch too much into your like analysis.
No, I loved that. I think the first thing I'm thinking is we got to get you in some debates, because that was perfect. I don't know actually how much I have to add to that, other than I think that's a good maybe much more succinct way of highlighting the problem I'm looking at. Because yeah, I think that is part of what I'm trying to capture, is that there is, like, when I was talking about like meaning functioning at like this quote unquote search for meaning of life functioning as a mediator between me and my life itself. I think that's what you said is a pretty good way of capturing that. That I guess almost that, like, I don't really like to use I don't like to use this word too much. I guess because people could make the same argument I've been making for the last couple hours, but I think it hurts our ability to be mindful, I guess, to be like present to just what is and what we're actually experiencing. Like, where it gets to a point where I'm almost like feel like I am obligated to, like, oh my God, like, what is my decision to go to Taco Bell signify? What is the meaning of this? Like, um, you know, as far as like things that maybe we shouldn't be attributing meaning to, I think that also happens. Like, I mean, one thing I didn't get a chance to bring up about Lacan, like one of the things I love about Lacan is the way he talks about trauma. And one of the things he looks at with trauma is that, like, part of what keeps it kind of coming back is this, like, search for some kind of meaning to the thing, like the scene or the event or whatever. And like this only perpetuates, this only keeps it like alive, basically. And that ultimately what happens is, I mean, he talks about it in terms of like orbiting around some image in our mind or some memory that we're never actually accessing, because that's just how it works. And that trying to give meaning to things ends up screwing us a lot of times. Like, like there's been experiences where I've talked to people where, they think, oh, God put this person in my life, and then a year or so later, it turns out this person is like just horrible for them to be around, some like toxic person. Well, now we've got a problem because now we've got this new question that we wouldn't have had in the first place, which is like, well, why did God send me my toxic boyfriend or my toxic girlfriend? Like, wherein if we didn't even categorize it as that in the first place, we wouldn't be running into this problem. So I think you're right. I think there are places where attributing meaning can actually be counterproductive. I've gone on, I think, long enough, but I did want to just say one last thing about the last thing you said, that, like, what did you say? Nihilism comes from meaning rather than the lack of it.
Yeah, in a
That's
sense,
something
yeah.
I'll have to think about.
Okay, let's get to the next question. So I got clarification on Control Alt Deletes. I think what he's basically asking, and English is not his first language, so he apologizes for the confusion. But he's
No
wondering,
problem.
like, vague. The term meaning of life is vague, and does that mean, is that the same as no meaning, or what exactly are you saying? Is it just vague, or is there no meaning at all from it?
I think by the time I got to the point where I was using the word vague to describe it, I had already felt like I'd been moved off of the tiny little hill that I've been kind of defending. Right. So I think by the time I started describing it as vague, I was already kind of giving it to Coco. Like, all right, even if this has some meaning, like, we can agree that it is rather vague. Which would, to answer your question, then I would say that something is not necessarily meaningless just on the basis that it's vague. Just that the meaning is unclear.
All right, let's go to Prime's question, and maybe Coco, this one you could take up too. I have,
Yeah. I mean, I did have some thoughts on Josh's question.
yeah,
If
go
that's
ahead.
okay.
Then we'll do Primes, and then we can start wrapping up.
Yeah. Yeah. he was talking about the idea that like when you give something meaning, it takes away from like the sanctity of it or the holiness of it. And this idea that nihilism comes from an abundance of meaning and not from a lack of meaning. That's like, I'm pretty sure that existentialism gets into that. I feel like I was listening to some Sartre stuff earlier today, and like that very idea comes up. But I don't think that when you say like something has meaning, or like what Varsity said specifically about like the idea of like God bringing someone into your life, like ultimately, I think that just gets back to my point that people aren't really like interested in doing the kind of thoughtful examination that would solicit a beneficial outcome for themselves. When that person says that God brought this other individual into my life, they're using it as a way to say like, oh, look how great this is. I'm overlooking all of these like blatantly obvious, awful things that are happening for the sake of like what I am like trying to inject sanctity into something. And I think that like, you know, I don't want to like play right into Varsity's hands and say we're all trying to do that, because I don't necessarily like believe that that is the case. But I do think that because of the way that we were brought up, because of the environment that we're brought up in, we are inclined to try to find some sort of like greater purpose in the things that happen to us, or some sort of like causal chain that leads somewhere. Like when I'm professing my love for my partner, I sometimes will say like I would literally go through every painful thing that I've already been through if it brought me to you again, as if it were those painful things that were the causal chain that actually brought me to being in the relationship that I'm in now. Like I can't for sure know that, because it could have been any number, like it could have just been like a deterministic fate that we would end up together, and I wouldn't know because I only have the ability to understand the experiences that I've had. So I can assume that there's some sort of causal chain, and if that brings me solace, congratulations, right? If it helps me treat her better, if it helps like fuel desirable outcomes, that's great. But like, I can't prove it. It's kind of just like out there in the ether. It's a faith thing. And I think that like someone will do the same thing with a bad relationship, and it's just like a natural consequence of the way that we were socialized in this world. And then when it goes south, they're not willing to continue doing the same thing, because intellectual or metaphysical consistency isn't something that's of concern to most people. I personally, you know, with the 2020 lens that I have on my past now, would look back and say like, yeah, if God does do the thing of bringing people into my life, he brought all the right people into my life, or it brought all the people right into my life, because it brought me to where I am now. And now I have a son, and now I love my life, right? Like, that's nice. That's all well and good. But like, if it had gone completely south of this relationship, I would do the same thing and say like, well, you know, if this is the causal chain, then there's something that's better that's after this. And I think that like thinking there's something that's better that's after this, like whether it's true or not, it's at least helpful. So that's another part of the reason why I would advocate for keeping the phrase around, or for still having some sort of analogous replacement for it, because I think that like ultimately it does provide value. And I think that it's not an issue of the phrase being the thing that takes away the sanctity or the meaning of something. I think it's an issue of the individual who's unwilling to do the necessary things to maintain that metaphysical and relational consistency that they have with the things that go on around them.
Okay, I want this.
Yeah, I
I
like
want to
that.
end this stream in like 8 minutes. So let's try to get to Prime's question. His question is, what does it mean for life to have an intrinsic meaning? I don't know if anyone brought up that specific term, but if you did, feel free to answer that. And then what does it not mean for there to be any meaning, and what difference does it make? So I know that's a lot for 8 minutes. I think basically his question comes down to why does it matter if there is or is not intrinsic meaning to life? If both of you maybe want to give your take on that, then we'll call it a day.
You want to go first, Coco?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so it feels funny that we're like answering the question of like, is there intrinsic meaning to life? Because like the whole point of this conversation was like, or I feel like we both kind of concluded that like saying that actually is like really just analogous for what's the purpose of it. So I'm going to answer it as if the question was, what's the purpose of it? Funny enough. But I don't think that there necessarily needs to be a purpose, and I don't think that there's a way for us to prove either way. I'm sure there's a lot of people who agree with that. That's very general. But I would say that even if we could prove that there was no purpose, that doesn't remove the impetus of the individual to find a reason to continue on if that's what they want to do, or to find a reason to, I mean, like, honestly, there can't be no purpose, because if you were to say there's no purpose, so I'm going to kill myself, you now have a purpose, which is to kill yourself because there's no purpose. So I think that, like, it's kind of like a cyclical way of thinking that ultimately doesn't really, like, get us anywhere. So I don't think that there's really any value in saying that it, like, doesn't have meaning. It feels kind of like an edgelord take, which I've been hearing a lot of those kinds of things lately. So not that this individual has one of those, I just think it's funny. But yeah, I don't think that life necessarily needs to have intrinsic meaning in order for it to have some sort of, like, meaning at all, if that makes sense. I think I answered the question, but I don't want to take up the whole time, so we can move on to what Varsity's thoughts are.
So, Prime, when people say there's an intrinsic meaning to life, I think what they generally have in mind is this idea that there is some meaning to life that just, that's what it is. I don't have to like it. I don't have to agree with it. I don't even have to know what it is. It just is the case. Whereas I think the debate is usually over intrinsic or objective meaning and subjective meaning. So, like, the question being, like, if there is no intrinsic meaning, like if there is no God, for example, to give life a meaning, is it still possible for me to create meaning, to find meaning, to give meaning to the things I go through in life? As far as what difference it makes, the position that I take is a little different, which is that I think that even if it is the case that there is a God that has given life some particular meaning, that this does not, for that matter, preclude the possibility of us creating our own meaning. Like, I think that's kind of the way existentialism is kind of marketed today, is that existentialism is only possible as a mode of life. I mean, and that's debatable whether that's actually what it's supposed to be or not, but let's assume it is. Let's assume it is some guide to how to live our lives in the absence of any objective meaning. I don't think that's true. I think that the things the existentialists have given us are viable, even if we do discover one day, or even if we still retain the belief in something outside of life, like a God, which is not, I don't know, it's kind of, I think, a little bit different from the way it's presented today, but I that's what I think is. So I guess maybe there is, I don't know that there necessarily is a difference that's made, because whatever the case is, I think the course that our lives can still take that direction regardless of where we stand on either issue.
All right, I think that's a good place to leave off. Thank you both. This was a very well ran debate. You guys, corrected yourself, stuck to the topic. If you went too far, gave each other ample time. So I appreciate that. And yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off this